Fulcrum Care are delighted to introduce you to Andy Etherington. Andy is the Executive Director of Caravel Limited. Hello Andy, thank you for joining us today. We're really grateful for you for being here for Pivotal People.
Thank you very much indeed, it's a pleasure.
What I want to do to start with is go right back to the very beginning.
An awful long way.
Yeah, we could all say that. So whereabouts did you tell me about your childhood and tell me about your education.
Oh gosh, that's quite interesting. I was born in Malaya. My father was a soldier. He was stationed out there. So I spent about the first 3.5 years out there. Came back to the UK really for only 6 months when I was about 3.5. I have no recollection of that at all. And then we were posted off to Germany. So I didn't really come and live in England until I was 10.
Really?
So yeah, I was 10 years elsewhere. So I was a stranger in this country when I turned up at age 10.
You were educated in Germany, or
well,
did you
so
come over?
So those years between 5 and 10, very early, I was sent off to a German-speaking kindergarten, and then went to primary school at one of the British Forces primary schools, where I remained until I came over to the UK in my 10th year. And that was the first experience I had of civilian schools, and it was a real shock. The entire it was a shock on several different levels. One is that I came out of army life in inverted commas and regimental life into civilian life, and actually the curriculum at the civilian schools were utterly different to the curriculum in the army schools. You know, there geography was all about the Commonwealth and where the army is stationed. I knew an awful lot about Canada and Africa and India and Australia and New Zealand. Well, I didn't know where the M1 was. And history as well was more to that direction. So that took quite a bit of getting used to, actually. I was like a fish out of water for a while.
Sure. What was at the end of your secondary school education, what were you looking to do with your life?
Well, you know, that I'm not sure at 18, 19, 17 you're thinking very clearly and lucidly, but I had figured out at the time that probably going the engineering route was not going to work for me, although I was very interested in it, and I was probably going to end up in some form of business. And it was a period of relatively high graduate unemployment, so I chose to do a degree that had a vocational element to it. So I took an international marketing degree, 4-year sandwich course. There was a big element of a foreign language, either German, French or Spanish. I did German. I trained through that with BP in Germany. So I did that very specifically because it ought to help me get a job. And a big component of finance and accounting, big component of law and economics. Otherwise, I might have done an economics degree.
Well, first of all, what took you into? You became CEO of various care companies fairly early on.
I'd like to say it was planned. But it wasn't planned. My first few years of my life, I trained with BP and then moved into sort of international, multinational companies in the retail and consumer environment. So I was with what is now Argos, but then went back into electronics. And I worked my way up the chain of command in Grundig and ITT and these businesses. And then back into retail. And that's where, by now I'd been labelled a bit of a change, well, turnaround, but it wasn't really. It was significant change management, and I was a managing director at the age of 30, and then went back into retail. It was a chain of office product superstores, sort of out of town, edge of town stores, but it wasn't working for the UK element of it. I was working for the European element, owned by a Swiss company. We were setting up a web platform. This was in 1998, 1999, predestined to sell that sort of stuff through the then emerging web. But it was going a little bit wrong for them in the UK, so they asked me to come and see if I could do a turnaround effectively. So I came back to that, did that, sold the business on behalf of the parent company, and then set about looking for a private equity-backed business, expecting it to be in retail and consumer. It wasn't. It was, to my surprise, a chain of learning disability hospitals, assessment and treatment, low secure and medium secure. So the highest end of the acuity level that you can manage in the private sector, for which I remain eternally grateful, because after that, moving down into elderly care or child care or supported living or dom care was easier for me because I'd been at this high level of acuity. The other way around, as an outsider coming into into social care, that might have been difficult. So that was a very good learning ground for me. And of course, it's different. Managing businesses of that nature and the people involved, so nurses, consultant psychiatrists, consultant psychologists, you can't talk with them in the way that you might talk to a whole bunch of store managers. That's not appropriate. It's not for them. I can get in front of a bunch of store managers and say, we're behind the pace here, like-for-like sales are down, the margin's under pressure, and by the end of 40 minutes they'll be coming up with good ideas of, right, boss, you better have some money back. But that's not the way to approach it in social care. And in any event, the route to the marketplace is different, entirely different.
As CEO of a very complex bunch of residents, really. Can you remember the first time you went into one of those services?
I can, and it was so we were out to look at them, and we started with a medium secure, so 17-foot fences, airlock gates, and this was challenging behaviour. So this was right at the top end of the acuity scale, and of course you have to take your wallet out and your phone out and your keys out. So it was. A shock is not the right word, but it was a slightly alien environment for me. And you might say, well, how on earth did I get chosen? Why did people choose to bring me on board? And I asked the same question. And they said, well, retail, multi-site, many people offering of a product or service through many people, fiercely KPI driven, fairly high barriers to entry, open all hours, not 24 hours a day as care is, but nonetheless, 7 days a week. So the business metrics dynamics are not dissimilar. But as I say, the route to the marketplace, utterly dissimilar. And of course, care is a regulated environment. So, you do need to understand these things quite quickly.
Yeah. And that was at the time of CQC, or was it
before? It was just before
Sky.
CQC. So this is now late 2004, early 2004.
Yeah.
So it was Sky, and the hospitals were under a different regulated H, something or other.
Yeah. So that regulation management, is that something that a very different thing for you to be managing? You wouldn't have the regulations about people that in retail that you would in care. So how did you cope with that change?
Well, I think there are, so that's an important difference, and the other difference is how the payment or funding goes, insofar as you have residents or patients, depending whether in a hospital environment or in a care environment, who are the beneficiaries of the treatment, but not necessarily paying the bill. So you have to begin to understand that, and you have to. I had to get a working knowledge of how regulation work so that I understand what was doing. But I drew very early a line in the sand there and said, right, that's on this side, that's me. That's everything to do with business and providing the environment for you to flourish, and everything on the other side is the delivery of care, and that includes managing the regulatory environment. But as a chief executive of various size businesses, you have to understand it a little bit. And the businesses I were running were, whilst they were enormously successful, they were in turnover terms, they were a good deal smaller than the retail businesses I'd run. In profitability terms, they were much higher. So they did try to drag you into the care side of things and the regulatory side of things. And so necessarily it's like you can't be a lawyer and everything else, but you know when to call in the lawyers, right?
Absolutely.
As a business person, and that's the same. That's how I sort of treated that. Really, I was very lucky in that first role. There was one of the shareholders, a consultant psychologist, took me under his wing, taught me that sector of the business. So people very quickly thought that I had spent much time, 20 odd years in the care sector, and I had to just say to them, hang on a minute, my knowledge is quite deep but narrow. It's all about learning disabilities, challenging behaviour, assessment and treatment. And it's a fascinating business, and I really enjoy it. And I do have to keep telling people, it is one of the key differences is if you're in retail, what's the worst thing that can happen? Your out of stocks can grow to, let's say, 1.5%, and 2.5%, that's bad news. 1.5% is okay. But what's the worst thing that happens? Somebody can come into the shop and can't get what they want. Yeah. So what? Yes, we lose turnover. In care, there are very vulnerable people at the end of that chain. Absolutely. We're here to provide care, provide the best quality care, and things will flow. When I started at the Learning Disabilities Care Principles, actually, some of the consultant psychiatrists and psychologists thought I was going to come in and try to devalue the brand by squeezing the margin. I had to say to them, look, the brand is what it's all about. If you imagine the glass of Coca-Cola, the syrup at the bottom is what it's all about, and yes, I can cheapen that, but you know what? People will recognise that it's not Coca-Cola anymore. And that's the same with delivering care. You need to deliver good care. That costs a certain amount of money. So that was in 2004, 2005. That role came to an end. I had decided I was going to stay in the sector, and I was going to start looking for my own endeavours for another role. And that's where I drifted into a turnaround. I was working with PwC. I was on their turnaround panel, and I went up to Manchester to look after a business called Manchester Care, which was in very distressed, and managed the turnaround of that business. And you get nudged down a path. You tend to get hired for that which you've done most recently. So I tended to be called into businesses that were suffering some form of stress or distress, really, at whatever level that might be. And yes, so I've managed 1,100 bed elderly care businesses. I've managed all sorts of. I was a non-executive director on a learning disabilities business, and I helped them shape that when the family were ready to sell the business. I helped them manage that sales process. 2008 financial crash. There was not a lot going on in 2008 and 2009 in the private equity driven part of the sector. There were no deals were being done, no business was being sold or bought, so that really quietened down. Clearly, people are not looking for buy-in candidates at that for the time; they're looking for other things. So gradually, I got moved down this route of helping distressed and stressed businesses. I have had to close homes.
Yeah, and sometimes that's the best thing.
No operator likes closing homes. Sometimes the best thing, and no operator likes closing homes. So my usual focus is try to find another route, but sometimes that is the right decision. You just have to do it very sensitively, because at the end of the day, people are living there who have lived there for a few years. It is their home.
I am aware that you've actually used a care home for your father.
This is true.
And you became a relative in a care home. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience? First of all, how did you choose the care home?
I mean, my father was a very, very strong, self-efficient individual. Yeah. And he should have gone into care much earlier, but I didn't have the heart, and that was probably wrong, to force the issue. And gradually he became less mobile, and he couldn't really move, and his quality of life at home wasn't so good because he wasn't moving around. And when he'd had a few falls, I managed to get him into a care home for some rehab, to try to get him, understanding that it's actually probably better there. He's got people around him, he's got interaction. That didn't quite work, because what happened there is he got regular meals and slept, and therefore he got better and whizzed around with it and said, no, I'm fine, and would discharge himself and go home. And within a very short period of time, he'd be back to where he was. Dementia took a hold, and it now became quite dangerous for him to live at home. His dementia had begun to bring out the less desirable character trait. Everybody has great character traits and not so good character. We all have that, but it brought out the less appealing. A care home that was specialising in dementia. It was a Victorian, Edwardian converted building. But as I often say, it's not the buildings that deliver care. It's the people. He was there for 3 years, so he was there a longer. He lasted longer than the average, and finally passed away. So
what about the future of care? How do you see the care industry in the next 20, 30 years?
That's a really good question. The market is not going to disappear. Absolutely not. In fact, the contrary, the market, if we're talking elderly care, is going to grow. There will be more pressure. There will be pressure on margins. There will be pressure on costs. Costs are escalating. It's difficult to get staff. But the market will remain, and there will be a demand for it. It's just going to be a little bit harder. It's harder now than it was 10 years ago, but it's absolutely doable.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a really interesting chat.